So again, I'd like to welcome you to this Flash Drought virtual workshop. My name is Marina Skumanich. I'll be the moderator today. My position, as I put in the chat box, is a program specialist in soil moisture information delivery for NIDIS, but also I'm one of the organizers for this conference. So we're really excited to be hosting this conference. Flash drought is an issue that's been of increasing importance to our work. We're certainly hearing about it from many of our DEWS regions. And so very, very glad to be putting this on. I should say, given the overflow crowd, the interest in participating in this conference, it's clear that we've tapped a nerve, and this is something that's broadly important at this time. So we've been planning this conference since early 2020 be in person because we've got a real emphasis on discussion and dialogue. If someone's joined in their microphone is on, if you could mute that. So we had planned this to be in person, but obviously have shifted to this virtual format. And so just to ask from all of you a little bit of patience as we work through our agenda and deal with what might be hiccups as far as getting the kind of dialogue and engagement that we're hoping for. But having said that, despite any hiccups, we're pretty confident that through the course of the next 3 days, we're going to have a chance to together develop a little more clear concept on what flash drought is and maybe what it isn't, as well as start to build a community-based research agenda on flash drought so we can really move forward in this domain. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned sort of our higher level goals, which is to have a clearer sense of this concept of flash drought, work on that together, as well as building this research agenda. But in order to achieve those goals, these are our workshop objectives we're going to be going through today. So first, we're going to strive for agreement as we can on the basic set of characteristics to which definitions of flash drought should adhere. And then as we go along, exploring most useful flash drought definitions by sector, region, and application as we can and as that comes up. So this will be our focus today. Then we'll turn to discussing, understanding, and documenting how existing tools and research can be shaped to meet user needs, both in the near term and in the future. So our objective here is to shift a little bit into the end user practitioner mindset. What are the issues that they're dealing with? And what's the kind of support they need to be alerted to, prepared for, and then able to respond to a flash drought when it comes. And tomorrow's session will be focused on this particular objective. Then we'll move to developing a list of outstanding research needs in monitoring, prediction, and planning response to improve early warning. This will be coming back a little bit more into the research realm, but of course we'll be drawing off our experiences of days before from the user community. And then finally, we'll be agreeing upon next steps for this emerging domain and how NIDIS and other partners can support research and coordination. So there's a lot to be covering in the next 3 days, and these are relatively short days, kind of in honor of the burden that virtual meetings pose. But we are really expecting a lot to come out of this, and I'm going to just ask you all to stay focused if you can through the whole 3 days and particularly into the last sessions of the last day, because that's when we'll really be bringing all of this together. Next slide. Okay, so each day we're going to go over our agenda, and today this is our schedule for the day. We've got all times in Eastern. We figured we needed a universal time that was a little bit more penetrable than UTC, so we're using Eastern and sort of basing our calendar off of that. After the brief welcome right now, we'll move into setting the context for this workshop. And so we thought to do that, it was pretty important to be hearing from people who have actually had to deal with flash droughts on the ground as state climatologists or otherwise managing them. So we'll have 4 presentations at that point. Let me mention that all of our presentations have been pre-recorded. We thought that would make it a little easier to share them, and also we'd of course have them for after the conference. But what that means is that you'll be able to live chat with the presenters as they go. And they also may be making some comments, annotating their own presentations. So, but that will be our format, pre-recorded presentations. After a quick break, then we'll go into a complimentary presentation of the survey that most of you, if not all, have received and taken, which was asking both flash drought researchers as well as practitioners how they define flash drought in practice and what are some of the perceptions they have of the term and the event. We'll take, again, an Eastern time, a lunch break, or wherever your time zone is, a little break there for some refreshment. And then when we return, we will be shifting again to focus on our specific objective for the day, which is this question of flash drought characteristics and how we can put some guardrails on our definitions of flash drought, given the circumstance currently, which is that there's just a wide range of different approaches to defining this concept. So we'll start out with that flash drought literature review presentation, which again, I think you all would have a copy of our report. So Joe will go into some details then about what exactly we found in terms of the range of definitions out there and the kind of indicators people are looking at. And then we'll finally move to the thing that, again, is sort of a cornerstone of this workshop, which will occur each of the 3 days, which is a breakout session, excuse me. And in this case, again, our focus will be on flash drought characteristics and a dialogue around that. Once we have the breakout and a little break after that, then everyone will return to this plenary for group discussion. So that's our day one. And I'm ready for the next slide. I'm not sure about the echo. Someone might need to mute their speaker. Great. Okay, very briefly, I think we're all getting pretty used to this at this point, but we would ask you, as we are going through the session, to mute your audio when not speaking and turn your video off unless you're asked to share. But we will be, again, using the chat box, so keep that open for both instructions, example, breakout links, and the Q&A. And then GoToMeeting does not have a raised hand option, so we've sort of devised this approach where if you have a question or a comment to share, you can either type it fully into the chat box or just type the word hand if you just assume not type your whole question out, and then we will queue you up to speak. And throughout the conference, and particularly getting into and out of breakout sessions, if you have any problems, please contact Tammy, and her contact information is there on the bottom. She's part of the UCAR support team for this conference. Next slide. We've gone over this for anyone who's a late arrival. We'd like you to have you add your affiliation to your name in GoToMeeting. So this is the way to do that. Click on the name and the attendees list, select edit name and email, and then add in your affiliation so that through the conference we'll know your organizational affiliation. Next slide. Okay, so I have to make a big shout out to our planning group, particularly our research advisors who helped us so much in the forming of this agenda. Andy Hoyle with the Physical Sciences Laboratory of NOAA, excuse me, Jason Atkins at the University of Wisconsin, Mark Svoboda, National Drought Mitigation Center Director, Mike Hobbins, also with NOAA PSL, and finally Roger Polwardi with NOAA PSL. So they were very instrumental in helping us hone on the important things for this agenda and really helping to make some impact in this domain. At the bottom, though, you have listed the NIDIS organizing team, Joel Lisenby, Molly Willosen, and myself. And of course, all credit goes to our advisory group, but any hiccups in the execution we'll take responsibility for. Next slide. Okay, now I'd like to turn to Visa Deheza, who would like to share a few welcoming comments on the conference.
Thanks, Marina. Welcome, everybody. Again, as Marina indicated, my name is Viva Deheza. I'm the Executive Director for NIDIS, based in Boulder, Colorado, at the Physical Sciences Laboratory. I also want to extend a welcome to everybody. It's very exciting to see the numbers of attendees that are joining us today for this conversation. I wanted just to give a little bit of perspective for the folks on the phone. I know several names, some names are new to me, so I'm excited to hear some new perspectives on this topic. But I wanted to provide the attendees just a little bit of context for why is NIDIS convening this with our partners. It really kind of, for me, it goes back to the time that I was actually hired with the NIDIS program back in 2012. My hiring came on the heels of a pretty significant flash drought event in the Midwest region of the country. And that particular event followed a very epic flood year for the Midwest region of 2011. So that event, as a flash drought event, really kind of started this dialogue, at least as from my standpoint, within the NIDIS program about what is this thing called flash drought? Is it a thing? Is it different than a drought? And what are the characteristics of it? And then following that, we saw another flash drought event happen in the Northern Plains in 2017. NIDIS with many state partners, some of whom you're going to hear from today, and some are also attendees in this workshop. That also was a pretty important event, not just from a research perspective, but also that it was a motivating factor for NIDIS to be reauthorized as a program for the second time. And so in that reauthorization language, NIDIS was asked to extend its purview a little bit and start to support activities specifically around seasonal to subseasonal forecasting and prediction, and to also look at things with a focus on things, drought indicators such as soil moisture, which we know have a very prominent role in identifying when a flash drought is setting up, or at least the literature indicates that could be the case. And so again, we see another flash drought that kind of spurs action, at least from NIDIS's perspective and Congress's perspective, in the reauthorization NIDIS, and also in the expectations that Congress had of NIDIS. And then finally, the most recent flash drought event in the Southeast. All these areas of the country are areas where NIDIS has a regional drought early warning system. So extremely important. Stakeholders and partners in these regions have identified flash drought as a priority. They want to understand it better, and they want to know if there are different approaches to mitigating for, planning for, preparing for these flash drought events. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Marina and say again, thank you very much for everybody who's joined us.
Okay, I got to get my microphone back on. Thank you, Viva. Yeah, so we are going to just move right into the next part of the agenda. If you do have any questions for either me or Viva, please do type them in the chat box and we'll respond there. But again, turning now to flash drought stories and experiences, we're going to hear from the following 4 people who are going to share different experiences they've had with flash drought. Now, let me get my notes because I want to make sure I get my affiliations right. So first, we're going to start with Mark Svoboda, who you probably all know. He's a director and associate professor at the National Drought Mitigation Center in the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Mark will be telling us a little bit about the inception of the term flash drought, where it came from, and why it was used, why he helped picked it. And then we'll turn to 3 practitioners who had to deal with flash droughts on the ground. Pam Knox is the agricultural climatologist at the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension, and she'll be talking about the 2016 and 2019 flash droughts in Georgia. Then Pat Ganan, state climatologist at the University of Missouri, will be telling Missouri's story about the 2012 flash drought. And then finally, Michael Downey, the water planning section supervisor at the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, will be talking about the 2017 Northern Plains drought and its effects on Montana. So we're going to go right into those presentations, again, pre-recorded, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Again, use the chat box as the conversation goes along, and then otherwise a little time afterwards for active Q&A.
Hi, my name is Mark Svoboda, and I'm the director of the National Drought Mitigation Center. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about flash drought, specifically, if I can borrow from the comic book world, my take on its origin story. The current American Meteorological Society concept is found in the glossary, touches on some key points, characteristics, if you will. 1 being rapid onset, 2, accelerated intensification, or severity, if you want to think of it in those terms, and importantly, culminating in impacts. I think this is real important as droughts are defined by their impacts. My first mention of the term came back in 2000, a drought in the Southern Plains, which I'll show you on the next slide. Used it first in the media prior to being put into the literature 2 years later. to describe it. And the motivation here was to heighten awareness of drought and find a term that would resonate with people. That other term being flash flood was the idea that people could understand, hey, maybe droughts don't all take months or years to develop. We can have these rapid onset droughts that bring a lot of impacts over a relatively short period of time. And in doing so, we can promote better drought early warning. That was followed by putting that concept into our BAMS article on the Drought Monitor in 2002. Myself and authors of the U.S. Drought Monitor at that time, and some others actually from some of the regional climate centers, talked about cases of flash drought. Again, being a rapid onset type of drought and taking into account the associated impacts. However, this was more of a concept and wasn't really formally defined at that time. Here's the drought I was speaking to that motivated this in the Southern Plains, where late summer 2000, we had less than 2% of this region, of these three states, in severe drought, or D2 or worse. And 8 to 12 weeks later, we were seeing over 80% of the region in severe drought or worse. So rapid onset, to say the least. If we take a little deeper dive, again, we're not just talking about how it ends, but rather how it begins. And so the concept here is that it could manifest itself into a hydrological drought, but it's how it starts is that we're focusing on here in the idea of being rapid onset. Keeping in mind that if there aren't any impacts, are you in drought? So I think there's still that impact piece that's pretty relevant as to whether or not is 2 weeks enough to be a drought if there aren't any impacts, or do you need those impacts? And timing is very important based on region and season, as flash droughts are not going to be the same in the northeastern part of the country as they are in the desert southwest, the southeast, or the Pacific Northwest for that matter. The drought that really put flash drought on the map, the iconic drought, if you will, for flash drought is 2012. This covered a large footprint over the midsection of the United States. You can see here 3 to 5 class degradations on the change map on the bottom left in the span of 8 to 12 weeks over this region, going from very little drought to a lot of extreme or exceptional drought. More recently, 2017 provided another case study in the northern and high plains where we saw 4 to 5 class degradation, issues with fires, issues with livestock forage, and natural ecosystems as well. The 2012 drought really, that flash drought, really put major emphasis on the research community and developing new tools to help us better monitor and track these sort of flash droughts. Just showing a smattering of products here, don't have time to go into them all, but really this was a way to use much more in the satellite realm to augment our in situ networks and to increase our spatial and temporal resolutions, and at the end of the day, I believe, our accuracy of tracking these flash droughts. Not that our work's done, but certainly we're in a much better place now than we were 10 years ago. To wrap up, flash drought, I think, is important because droughts cover so many different temporal time footprints, right? Days to decades, as we like to say. A lot of effort on the subseasonal to seasonal forecasting realm, which would be very welcomed, very challenging to bring flash drought into the conversation. I know CPC, the Climate Prediction Center, is working on some new flash drought guidance materials as well. Making sure that we don't let stuff die on the vine or wither on the vine, if you will, as we bring products from research to operations, as this is always a challenge, but many of these products will simply go away if they're not maintained. And it's important that we consider all of those products and then some, not just the ones I showed on the prior slide, because no single driver is going to give you the answer of flash drought, again, because it's different to many different people and to different sectors. But I do hope that flash drought can help us get into a different mindset of thinking about it as a torchbearer for better drought early warning. I think we can do a better job of not being as conservative if we look at some of these new breed tools and say, for example, the drought monitor, where we can show onset in a much more timely manner. And we did see that between 2012 and 17, where there was a couple months lag back in 2012 to that drought, that flash drought, whereas in 2017 it was literally just a week or two, and we were much more on top of that compared to 2012. Because at the end of the day, there's really no excuse for having drought sneak up on us. And apathy, as you see here in the cartoon, apathy is a big challenge to overcome. Finally, to me, dealing with flash drought isn't just about changing all of our tools in our tool set, but rather our mindset, particularly when it comes to monitoring, decision making, and planning. We have to change it from a slow onset only to consideration for rapid onset events. As slow onset disasters, when it comes to drought, we don't want that to become our only doctrine. And hopefully, by doing so, we can appeal to the shorter decision timelines that resource managers, decision makers, and policymakers have. They're not always going to be looking out at the multi-year time frame. And this flash drought concept is a way to get it on their radar and begin the integration of drought risk management into the decision-making process, practice, and policy. Thank you very much. You can reach me at my email address here for any offline questions. And thanks again for listening in.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And again, just want to ask people, if you have any questions for Mark, go ahead and put them in the chat box. And otherwise, we'll go ahead and start the next presentation. Oh, we've got a question. Hold on one second, Brian. So go ahead. Muthavel, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, but go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, this is Muthavel Chalaya from CPC. Nice review, Mark. Just a quick thought and question. You said the flash drought was introduced, the terminology around 2000 and beyond. Was that a coincidence that the USDM also was introduced, or we had a USDM around 2000? So was that a coincidence? The flash drought, the USDM came around the same time?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
Marina? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I guess I would call it a coincidence. I think it made us aware by doing this consolidated composite indicator like the drought monitor, which brought in several indicators. I think we saw that we could capture these better, and then I think we found in 2012 that not good enough, and then we had a bunch of tools produced in 2017. I think we really brought that latency reaction time down for responding and monitoring it. So I think the tool, yeah, I think basically it was a coincidence, but it did heighten awareness because we saw how droughts ebb and flow spatially, and we could see, hey, this thing's developing much more quickly than you would think traditionally droughts do. And I think the Drought Monitor brought a lot of awareness to it because of the media and groups like the NPR and the Weather Channel in particular, as well as major newspapers.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, let's turn to the next presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pam Knox. I'm the director of the University of Georgia Weather Network and also an agricultural climatologist. And I'm going to be talking today about two flash droughts that we've had in Georgia in 2016 and 2019. Just want to put things in historical context first. This is a timeline of all the droughts we've had in Georgia since 2000, which is when they started doing this drought monitor timeline. And you can see that we've gone through several periods of extended droughts. The first of the ones that are shown here is 1998 to 2002, and then 2 other major droughts. And then since then, 2 shorter droughts, the flash droughts I'm going to be talking about today in 2016 to 17, and then another one in 2019 as well. So Georgia is certainly no stranger to drought. It happened quite often, and a lot of my life here has been really affected by the droughts that have come and gone. First drought I want to talk about is the 2016 drought. This is a timeline of drought that was put together by Chip Conrad and myself for an article that we wrote a few years ago about this. And you can see that this drought really lasted for 4 seasons, started in the spring of 2016 with a really long time period when not a lot was going on. We had abnormally dry conditions. The drought really developed gradually. It sort of crept into the area. And then over the summer, it maybe increased a little bit, waned a little bit towards the end of the summer. But it wasn't until fall when that drought really exploded and became much stronger. And you can see it really peaked right around the end of November before we started to get the winter rains come in, and that knocked things back somewhat. The very tail end is a drought down in Florida that started to increase the area of the southeast that was covered by drought. So lasted about a year in the southeast and really caused quite a bit of impact on agriculture in the area. The flash drought in 2016 was probably driven more by rainfall than temperature, and I'll show the rainfall in a minute. Here's a thermograph that shows the daily temperatures in Athens for 2016, and you can see the average temperatures in the green band, the extremes in red for extreme highs and blue for extreme lows, and then the grays are the actual temperatures for 2016. And even though there were some periods where it got relatively warm and other periods where it got pretty cold, we really did not have a really strong time period of near record temperatures until almost the end of October. It was quite warm that month. So a lot of the dry conditions that you saw in the previous slide were not really caused so much by temperature as they were by precipitation. And let me show you why. Down at the bottom here is a timeline that shows the daily rainfall values at Lafayette, Georgia, which is up in the northwest part of the state. And you can see that there's quite a bit of rain early in 2016, which caused things to look quite wet going into the growing season. And then there's a long period, which is shown by the pink arrows there, where we had rain, but it was fairly infrequent and it wasn't very strong. So we had a long period where the rainfall was below normal. And that was the time period which the drought really started to show up in the northwestern part of Georgia. You can see the map there in the top right shows the first week of the drought monitor when we had severe drought showing up in Georgia, up in the northwest part. It's interesting because by that time we were already seeing a lot of agricultural impacts from the drought, but really nothing that was showing up on the drought monitor because they were also including all that really wet conditions at the beginning of the year. Most of the temperatures early in the year were relatively cool all the way through May, but then the rest of the year was warmer than normal, which is what it usually is. In these days, we're seeing a lot of trends towards warmer temperatures. And then what's even more noticeable, if you look later in the season where the red arrow is on the timeline of rainfall, there's a long period of over a month with absolutely no rain whatsoever. So that coincided with the period when the flash drought was really ramping up quickly, starting in September and going all the way till almost the end of November. Long period, and of course, not surprising that the temperatures would be very warm then as well. Now that spring dryness is interesting because that hit at the time when corn was growing and pollinating up in northwestern Georgia. So dry that the silk stayed so dry that pollen would not stick to it, and as a result of that, they just didn't have any kernels develop in a lot of the corn unless it happened to be in irrigated fields, which there's some up there, but there's definitely a lot of fields that are not irrigated there as well. So if we look at a list of some of the impacts from the 2016 drought, you can see there were a lot of wildfires across northern Georgia and into North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. The picture on the left-hand side there just shows one of the days with a lot of the smoke. I can remember walking outside of my office in Athens and just having it smell like a campfire because of all the smoke that was coming off of those fires. Happens a lot more often out west than it does here in the southeast, but it was definitely memorable for me. And the picture on the bottom left there is a picture of Gatlinburg, Tennessee, with the fires looming over the city. So some of the other impacts from that drought include the lack of a corn crop in northwest Georgia. You can see down at the bottom there a difference between irrigated fields, which are on the outside, and the non-irrigated fields on the inside, which have very poor kernel production. And so that was a problem. Another thing that was really affected by the early part of the drought was the forage production. Right at the end of winter, of course, the farmers don't have a lot of hay left, and they're really counting on the pastures to green up so they can feed their cattle. But because it was so dry, the pastures stayed dry as well, and they really had to import hay from other places to keep their cattle alive, or they had to sell them off. We also saw over the course of the summer, some of the streams were drying up in northeast Alabama and northwest Georgia. A couple places in Georgia actually had to truck in water. So there was definitely impacts from that drought that we saw across the. Now the 2016 drought, the flash drought part of it really ended towards late November when we started to get those rains, but it sort of morphed into a hydrologic drought. And you can see this is a hydrograph of the Chattahoochee River at Helen, which is up in the northeastern part of the state. And the stream flows went down all through the drought season, but they actually were at the relative driest conditions in the spring of 2017. So there were long time periods in January through March when they had never seen stream flows that low before. That certainly caused some problems. There's not a lot of tourism then, but there's some tubing that goes on that river. Certainly a problem for water supplies for some of the smaller communities along that river. And so the end of the flash drought partly ended because of rainfall, but also partly ended because eventually we started to get more rain from that. The flash drought of 2019 looks a little bit different. This is a timeline of the drought for that, and you can see it started again in March, but it really has two peaks. So in fact, some producers actually said we've had two different flash droughts in 2019 because they're looking at the very short-term impacts of the lack of rain and the dry conditions on agriculture. In this case, in 2019, I think that the flash drought was much more linked to temperature than it was to precipitation. Here you can see the thermograph. This time it's for Macon, so it's in the center of the state, but it works the same way. And I have highlighted here two time periods when we had a week or more of record-setting temperatures. So the first one corresponds to that first peak on the drought timeline, where things got dry very early because of the warm temperatures, and then settled down a little bit in the middle part. We had more rain, we had cooler temperatures, so evapotranspiration was lower. And then as we went on into late September and into the first week of October, we set daily records almost every day. In fact, it was warmer at the first week of October than it had been at any other time during the year. So that didn't really feel like fall at all. And that really contributed to that second peak of drought in the fall of 2019. Some of the impacts that we saw from the 2019 drought, we saw a lot of yield reduction in the crops again. Forage was completely lost. In fact, the earliest indicators that we were in this first peak of the flash drought, so I started getting phone calls from livestock producers saying, our grass isn't growing again. What are we going to do? And we're worried about whether or not they'd be able to apply for relief from the government for loss of forage, which in most cases they were not able to do. Late rain did come at the end. It caused some problems for harvest as well because it rotted the peanut vines. And so a lot of the peanuts got left in the ground, and that reduced their yields as well. But finally, when that rain did come, they were starting to produce winter forage again and started to plant their onions as well. I want to end the discussion here by talking about why we really think about flash drought a lot in Georgia. For one reason, we have water holding capacities in our soils that really don't hold a lot of water. And so that's a problem because we need to have that regular rainfall. There's not a lot there that plants can draw upon if we go through a dry spell. Second is that we do have a long growing season, as we do in most of the Southeast, which means that there's a lot of crops at the same time, a long period when evapotranspiration and evaporation is high because of the temperatures. And so flash droughts can develop very quickly in that sort of situation. And then third, from a standpoint of getting relief, a lot of the relief rules for groups like forage producers are linked to counties. In Georgia, we've got 159 counties. They're relatively small. You can see in the map there that they're much smaller than the similar counties in Alabama or in South Carolina. And so when you have relief that's linked to the counties, there's a lot of pushing by the producers to say, draw the line closer to me because maybe still just a county away. So really we're hampered, I think, by having such small counties compared to other parts of the Southeast. In the area that becomes eligible for getting this kind of forage relief is much smaller in Georgia just because of the county size than anything else. I'm going to end it there. I want to thank you for your attention, and here's my contact information. And I think we may have time for a couple questions. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. Let's see, we've got a couple questions coming in through the chat box. Start with Joel. He's asking, from your perspective in Georgia, what makes a flash drought different from other droughts, Pam?
I think of it more in terms of the length of time over which it occurs. Some of the earlier droughts, and I see there's another question about which other droughts we've had. We didn't have a lot of droughts in the period of 1958 through 1980. It's also the coolest period in Georgia history, so that's kind of interesting to look at. We had a big drought in 1998 to 2002. We had another one in 2007 to 2009. That was the one that made news because they were talking about Atlanta running out of water. And Governor Perdue at the time had a prayer day for rain on a very carefully chosen date when they knew it was going to rain. And then there was another one in the central part of the state from 2011 to 2013, which I was actually the state climatologist at the beginning of that. We predicted that we'd go into drought. It was a great forecast, but the governor didn't like it because a lot of producers had lost money in the last drought. So the state climatologist title was moved into one of the state agencies. Fortunately, they didn't fire me. They just took away my title. But and then since then we've had these two shorter droughts. It would not surprise me at all if we go into drought again next year because La Nina is often linked to drought in Georgia. So I'd say probably it's the length and how fast it moves on. A lot of these impacts, like the corn, we can't really even tell about it until maybe months down the road. The farmers might know that their ears aren't looking right, but until we see the yield production, we're not going to know how bad it was.
Okay, Pam, another question came in. How does daily wind speed compare in the two periods?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really looked at that. I guess I have the data now. I could do it. Wind speeds are never really very high in Georgia. We're not a good place to have wind energy, for example. And so I tend not to think about that. But that would certainly be an interesting question to look at. I guess the amount of solar energy coming in would also be something interesting to look at.
Okay, great. There's some more comments in the chat box. I'll let you respond as we keep going, though. So, Brian, let's turn to the next presentation.
Hello, my name is Pat Gannan. I'm an extension state climatologist with the University of Missouri. We'll talk a little bit about today about the flash drought Missouri experienced back in 2012. It indeed was a historical event, one that I've been here for 32 years and never seen one when it comes to the magnitude and how quickly things went downhill in regard to the flash drought of 2012. It began in the spring and it persisted through most of the summer, and unfortunately, that's the worst possible timing and where you could experience a flash drought starting in the spring and then just continuing through the heart of the growing season. And indeed, that's what happened. You can see in the upper right on May 1st, 2012, there really was no drought to speak of in our state. We had some dry conditions in northeast and southeast Missouri, but by the end of July, you can see extreme to exceptional drought covering most of the state. And by the end of August, that exceptional drought expanded even more in parts of western and southeast Missouri. Most of the rest of the state was in extreme drought. There were some variables that really acted with this dry condition to give the drought some teeth, and I'll talk a little bit about those variables later. I mentioned them here, and then the impacts from this drought were just amazing in regard to how many there were and the sectors that were impacted. And what really stuck out in my mind was, of course, how quickly they emerged, but the vulnerability issues that were exposed in our state. And yet it was really a short-lived drought when we provide historic perspective. The middle image does show the May through August average precipitation. You can see 2012 ranked as the third driest on record. You have to go all the way back to 1953 to find nearly 60 years to find a similar dry period for that May through August period. Crop conditions were just tanked. They went downhill quickly for corn, soybean, and pastures and ranges, as you can see in the lower left, showing 2012, the red line, just how the percentage that were in good to excellent conditions. They just took a tumble starting in May and through the end of June and on through the rest of the growing season. And then on the bottom right, just really kind of hits home on how short-lived this drought was. When you provide historic perspective. On the right is 1952 to 1956. We had 5 consecutive growing seasons with drought versus what we saw in 2012, just one severe drought during that growing season. And yet those little bubbles you see just to the left are all the impacts that we saw in our state. It went way beyond agriculture. Most other sectors were impacted by this exceptional dry period. I talked a little bit about some of this briefly about the supplemental variables that really acted with the lack of precip to give this drought some teeth. Temperature was one of them. 2012 was our warmest year on record. That dryness began in January or in the fall and persisted through the spring into the summer. We had our warmest spring on record in 2012. We had our warmest March on record, so on and so forth. We were breaking records left and right with this highly unusual temperature departures that we were seeing here in Missouri. In March, we actually had more of a March that was more typical of Louisiana in regard to temperatures. That's just how unbelievably warm. And that warmth really kind of it exacerbated the situation in regard to the lack of precip that we saw during the growing season of 2012. Another issue was the vapor, water vapor, the moisture content of the atmosphere. And these are vapor pressure deficits using Mesonet data. We're able to, we have some history of over 25 years of records of vapor pressure deficits, and that's the green line is the average, and you can see the orange is what we saw in 2012. So anything above that green line shows a drier than average atmosphere. And so you can see we had low humidities, we had these large vapor pressure deficits, and that's a variable that's nice to use because it's very important in plant and water relations. And it's for when it comes to growing plants because it controls the transpiration rates of the vegetation. And so we saw a very efficient and dry atmosphere when it comes to transpiration losses during that growing season. And that, again, in addition to high temperatures, these high vapor pressure deficits that were contributing, giving teeth to the lack of precip to make the flash drought. Radiation obviously is very important. Solar energy is the driving force when it comes to evaporative demand. We have pyranometers on our Mesonet stations, so we're able to get an idea of what's average during the growing season when it comes to solar output using our pyranometers. And the pinks, those are the blue dots, and then the pink dots are what we saw in 2012. There were only 3 cloudy days from May 1st to the end of July here in mid-Missouri. And so it was just an amazing, a lot of sun's energy that was able to get to the surface and actually really ramp up those evaporation losses. So we had high vapor pressure deficits, we had high temperatures, we had lack of precip, and we had a lot of solar radiation making it to the surface and bringing this really high evaporative demand. Of course, when you combine those variables in addition with wind, you can calculate potentially evapotranspiration. These are ET rates over the past decade, and you can see 2012, that line, as you accumulate evapotranspiration from May 1st to the end of August, nothing comes close to the water loss that we saw in 2012. And so another way to look at that on the evaporative losses that we saw, you can use Class A pan evaporation records, which are shown in the lower right, indeed showing how unusual 2012 was. You have to go back to 1988, 1980. Those were historic droughty heat wave years here in Missouri and for the Midwest, for that matter, and even the Southern Plains. But indeed, we just saw all these unusual factors that came into place to really give the drought some teeth and make it a flash drought that persisted into the summer. Another characteristic I always like to look at are the soil characteristics, because here in Missouri we have actually quite a few high clay content soils, which has an impact. It's a little bit more hard. It's harder for the root systems to tap into those the water molecules that adhere to the clay-like soils and be able to use that water for growth. And so soil characteristics are very important, especially when you consider a drought that starts in the spring when row crops are being planted. You need some moisture and the root systems to tap into that. And so better soils in Iowa and Illinois, if all else being equal, we likely see more impacts showing up more quickly here in Missouri, considering the flash drought that we saw in 2012, and indeed that was the case. Again, I mentioned how timing, it's all about timing. It was the worst possible timing early in the growing season to go into this droughty situation, and we saw impacts. And obviously here are impacts from mid-Missouri around Columbia and just east of Columbia. By the early June, we were seeing on the left that picture showing scorched tips of corn, the curled leaves. In the middle picture, those soybeans, some of the seeds were not, there was no moisture in the soil to germinate, and so we had uneven emergence. And then on the right there, we saw by the end of June, we saw corn that was tasseling and it wasn't even 4 feet tall. So it was very evident we were seeing major crop issues, major crop losses, yield reductions, and yet at the same time, you can see the drought monitor map. It took a little while to catch up with these conditions. They were only showing abnormally dry conditions in early June, as you look at through much of mid-Missouri, and then as you go to the right, by the end of June, only moderate drought conditions. I would say it was worse than that, considering what these pictures are revealing in regard to drought stress. Communication is highly important when getting the word out when these conditions start to occur, and I think we did a pretty good job in getting the word out. We used the cooperative media group here with the University of Missouri Extension, and those news releases went out and to all the news outlets. And then the word flash drought, that middle image came from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on May 23rd. We did another news release by May 25th, and with the title Flash Drought, and then National Public Radio picked it up. In the bottom issue, or the bottom, you can see the news release, the flash drought threatens to destroy Missouri. And so these were just some of the highlights or some of the quotes starting in the middle part of May, where we began to recognize the situation was looking pretty dire, and to get the word out that these impacts were not going to go away. In fact, they were likely going to worsen. And so it's very important to get that information out and to let the state administrators and the decision makers at the state and national level know what we're experiencing. The response in Missouri was nothing short of amazing. They quickly recognized the situation, and there was a lot of coordinated efforts with the administration, state, federal, private, and volunteer agencies, organizations, associations, many groups and cooperatives that really went in full force to try to mitigate the situation we were experiencing. We had a lot of resources that were put together. Emergency cost share programs were used from the Soil and Water Conservation Program and the districts with the Department of Natural Resources, and to help dig existing wells and make them deeper and to drill new ones. There were projects approved for connections to water systems, emergency grants for running pipes and installing pumps, waivers for oversized loads of hay for livestock, conservation release program working with the FSA to release livestock for grazing. State Emergency Operations Center was activated. We had an online hay directory, as well as and at the very bottom bullet there, you can see on July 17th, by mid-July, actually Missouri became the first state where the governor had submitted and all the counties were declared a drought disaster by the USDA. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the flash drought in Missouri.
Great, thanks very much, Pat. We've got a question from Mike. I think that's a more general question, Mike, not specific to Pat's presentation. Let's first see if there are any questions for Pat right now. Okay, and then I think, Mike, maybe we could ask people to respond in the chat box to your question there. And otherwise, I think we're ready to turn to the next presentation.
Hi all, thank you for having me here today. My name is Michael Downey, and I coordinate drought monitoring efforts for the state of Montana. I'm going to talk to you today about the 2017 flash drought in Montana, which gripped the northern high plains in the spring and summer of 2017. In order to understand why we were all caught so flat-footed in the spring of 2017 requires an understanding of the antecedent conditions in the fall of 2016. In September and October of that year, some parts of Montana received over 6 inches of precipitation, which accounts for more than half of their average annual precipitation in many parts of the state. Moreover, temperatures that fall were on the cool side of average, and with all the precipitation, soil moisture was high. Snowpack that year was also very strong. Only the Musselshell Basin was below normal, with the remainder of the basins looking much above average snowpack. Truth is, given the wet fall and a strong winter, we weren't even thinking about drought. All the worry that spring was over the potential for flooding. The first reports of abnormally dry conditions came in mid-May. Hard to believe after such a wet fall and a good winter. By the end of May, the drought monitor showed only the first signs of drought in the northeastern corner of Montana. Within 4 weeks, a small patch of D0 or abnormally dry conditions had morphed into D3 in extreme drought conditions with more drought radiating west. By the end of July, D4 exceptional drought had taken hold in the northeastern corner, and 80% of the rest of the state was experiencing some level of drought from D0 to D4. Glasgow, Montana, in the northeast, represented the epicenter of drought that summer. This graph shows the 2017 water year precip versus average. The x-axis shows months and the y-axis shows inches of precip. The blue line is average, the red dashed line is 2017. Apart from the anomalously wet fall, precipitation through the winter and spring was mostly average until mid-April or so, when the spigot promptly shut off. This graph shows mean max temperatures in Glasgow in May. The blue represents mean max temperatures for 30 years from 1986 to 2016. The red is May of 2017. As the rains ended, temperatures went up. The first 2 weeks saw 10 days with max temperatures as high as 25 degrees above average. Above normal temperatures persisted for most of the month. High temperatures persisted in June, with temperatures exceeding 20 degrees above normal on multiple days. June is typically Northeast Montana's wettest month of the year. In June of 2017, Glasgow recorded less than 1/4 of an inch of precip. Conditions were similar in other parts of the state. In West Glacier in Montana's far west, a wet fall and winter made for a strong snowpack. Despite a normal June, precip in July and August went to near zero. Temperatures were also similar as in the Northeast. Western Montana saw temperatures in May rise above normal for 24 days that month, with multiple days approaching 20 degrees above normal. The 2017 drought reached its apex in September. with 91% of the state in D1 to D4 status and the remaining 10% in D0. Despite the most severe drought in almost 100 years, the worst fire season in more than 100 years, the 2017 water year ended with most of the state's river basins at above normal for that year. This graphic offers a good illustration of the pitfalls of using water year percentage of normal as a drought indicator, but more on that later. Surprisingly, most of Montana's rivers and streams ran normal to above normal throughout the summer of 2017. This graph shows flows on the Yellowstone River at Sydney on Montana's eastern border. In that summer, the Yellowstone ran above normal from May through late August and never dropped below normal that year. In response to the 2017 flash drought, Montana's retooled its drought monitoring process. Prior to that summer, Montana only consulted with the U.S. Drought Monitor on a monthly basis, which quickly proved inadequate. We have now formed a diverse, multidisciplinary group that includes consultation with adjacent states. We perform a weekly analysis of conditions across the state. We consult weekly with the U.S. Drought Monitor. We've developed a regional drought indicators dashboard so that all our partners can look at the same indices. And we've developed the Montana Drought Impacts Reporter to help monitor drought conditions on the ground. I just want to thank NIDIS, NOAA, and NDMC for having me here today, and thank our many partners that make our drought monitoring program possible. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments. Thanks.
Great, Michael. Thank you very much for that. And of course, all of these are interesting stories, sort of the expectation of flooding that only turn around and have a drought. So we've got a couple questions for Pat, but before we get to that, just want to check if anybody's got questions for Michael on his presentation. Again, you can type them in the chat box or go ahead, right hand there. All right, well, while we're waiting on that, let's circle back to a couple questions for Pat. Pat, Dennis Tody is asking, what were the conditions in Missouri back in late 2011?
In late 2011, 2011 was interesting. It actually started out pretty wet the first half of the year. There was a heat wave and drought impacting the southern plains in 2011 that started to spill over into southwest Missouri during the early part of summer. And then as summer progressed into the fall season of 2011, the dryness expanded across Missouri, but then we had a wet period late in the fall in November on into December. And I believe that by the end of 2011, those wetter conditions in late fall, early winter mitigated the situation statewide, where I believe only a little bit of abnormally drought conditions were reported in southwest Missouri. So by the end of 2011, we were back looking pretty good in that regard.
Great. Another question for you. For the Missouri flash drought, was there coordination with the Weather Service, weather forecast offices, or the river forecast centers? If so, how, and was it helpful?
Oh, I have to think about that one. I believe there was a little bit of coordination, but I think mostly back in 2012, I worked or coordinated a lot with University of Missouri Extension. I worked with a lot of the agronomists and livestock specialists in sending email requests on providing impact information and pictures on what was happening in Missouri. And so a lot of that information that I then would share with the public and through the cooperative media group was coming through Extension. But I believe there was a little bit more, there was a little bit of coordination with the Weather Service offices. And over the years, though, that's increased greatly. So I use the WFOs quite a bit in current situation over the past few years.
Okay, great. So we've got just about, well, I got 1 minute before our break time. Any other questions for any of the panelists right now? And again, you all can continue to use the chat box, or and you can, by the way, I think You may have noticed, pick a specific person to chat with. So if you want to carry conversations forward with any of these people as we move on to other topics, feel free to do that. So yeah, thank you very much to all of you for your presentations. Again, really helping us set the context for what we're up against here and some of the complexities of this phenomenon. So what we're going to do now is take our 5-minute break. So please go ahead. Stay part of about the meeting, but please go off and take your bio or other breaks now, and we'll circle back in about 5 minutes. Brian, let's go ahead and get started with this next section. Great. So again, having heard directly from some of the practitioners, their experiences, we're now going to shift to report out on the survey we did across the U.S. with our DEWS listservs, as well as flash drought researchers, to find out how is flash drought defined in practice. What are the ways that the term is understood, and what are some of the questions people have or concerns about using that term? And so for this, we'll have Tanya Haidt, who is a regional sociologist and project manager at the National Drought Mitigation Center.
Welcome to this presentation on perceptions of flash drought. My name is Tanya Haidt, and I'm a research sociologist with the National Drought Mitigation Center. Over the past few months, I worked with a team of NIDIS staff to administer a survey to inform the efforts of this workshop, to better understand and meet end user needs related to flash drought. For the next 15 minutes, I'm going to share what we learned from the survey with regard to how flash drought is understood within and outside of the research community. While we're very interested in your perceptions as flash drought experts, we also really want to understand the perspectives of those who use drought information in decision-making and policy-making. So we invited everyone in the NIDIS DEWS mailing lists and newsletter to take a survey on flash drought. The survey had 2 sets of questions, one for flash drought researchers and one set for end users of drought information. We don't have an exact number of people who received the invitation, but the estimate would be about 6,000 individuals or a bit more. So many people who do research related to drought or flash drought responded to the survey invitation, and thank you for that. But we did not have a large response from end users, less than 5%. So we won't be reporting the survey results as being truly representative of end users as a whole, but rather providing snippets of input, like if some extra end users who are interested in flash drought could be at this workshop today. So, who are these folks who are joining us at the workshop through their survey answers? Of the end users who responded to the survey, 47% have a role in communicating information to others. 41% classified themselves as decision makers. 38% are educating and engaging the public, and 11% are policymakers. Most are federal, state, or local agency employees, but there are a few individuals representing tribal agencies, businesses, nonprofits, media, and other affiliations as well. And they work with a variety of sectors. Most work with water management, agriculture, crops and livestock, forestry and ecology, and hazard and emergency planning, response and relief. A smaller number work with fire management, energy or business, public health, or recreation and tourism. Tomorrow, you'll be talking about the needs of these specific sectors, and you'll use some of the survey results to inform those discussions. But today, we're going to talk about the perceptions of end user respondents as a whole group. So we had responses from end users in all parts of the country, and we asked them if they had heard the term flash drought to describe drought in their region. And overall, about half had heard of flash drought and half had not. I'd say given the bias of the survey response, I'm guessing that in the actual population of NIDIS's contact lists, a much lower percent has probably heard of flash drought. But we did find that respondents in some regions of the country are more likely than others to have heard of flash drought, namely the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Midwest, as you can see in this graphic. Respondents in the Northwest and Southwest are least likely to have heard a flash drought to describe drought in their region. We asked all of the respondents who had heard of flash drought if they think the distinction between flash droughts and other droughts is useful for monitoring and communicating. And what we heard is that essentially flash drought researchers find the distinction more useful than do end users or other researchers. As shown in the bottom bar, almost 90% of flash drought researchers see the distinction as at least moderately useful. While in the bars above, you can see that it's more like 60 to 65% of end users and other researchers who see it as at least moderately useful. Further, of those who have heard the term, a little over 50% of end user respondents find the term flash drought to be at least somewhat confusing. So to better understand why there might be some confusion and some equivalence about the usefulness of the concept, we investigated how flash drought researchers and end users understand flash drought. We asked end users what they think of when they hear the term flash drought, and we asked flash drought researchers how they intend it to be interpreted when they use the term. We got a wide variety of responses with some themes emerging, and those are listed on this slide. Respondents talked about interpreting the term flash drought in terms of the speed of onset or intensification, the duration of the event, the drivers or causes of the event, the impacts, the season or seasonality of the event, the intensity of the event, the extent in terms of being localized or more widespread, the ability to forecast or predict it, and there were a smattering of other comments. And of course, some respondents expressed uncertainty about the meaning of flash drought. So I coded the responses for these themes to see how often each was mentioned by researchers and end users. And this graph shows the percent of respondents in 4 different groups who mention each theme. It shows the percent of flash drought researchers in blue, other researchers in gray, end users who have heard of flash drought in orange, and end users who have never heard of flash drought in yellow. The most common theme mentioned is the rate of onset and intensification. But of end users who have never heard of flash drought, respondents were less likely to mention the rate of onset and slightly more likely to mention the drought's duration. Duration was also mentioned by over 25% of end users who have heard of flash drought. End users also mentioned specific drivers such as lack of precipitation or high temperatures and the impacts that might occur. And other themes were mentioned less frequently. But as you can see, every theme came up at least to some extent in every group. So to add to our understanding of why the concept of flash drought may or may not be confusing or useful, we also asked end users about flash droughts that they have experienced. We asked them to provide examples of what they would consider to be flash drought events, in addition to 6 events that we listed for them in the survey. Examples include drought events from the 1970s and every decade since then, and located across the country, with Western US examples showing up more so in the last 5 years or so. Many respondents gave examples from this year. You may dispute whether these all should be considered flash drought events, but it may be useful to consider the examples that came to people's minds. We asked end users whether the flash droughts that they had experienced seem more similar or more different compared to other droughts in their region. The percent who said flash droughts were mostly similar to others is in blue, different is in orange, and those who said they did not know is in gray. So in many parts of the country, respondents are more likely to say that the flash droughts they experienced were more similar to other droughts than they are to say that the droughts were more different, particularly in the Midwest. But in the Northern Plains and Southeast, the respondents were as likely or more likely to think the flash droughts they experienced were more different from other droughts. So you can see a little bit of a regional difference there, but a good proportion in every case of folks who thought the droughts seemed mostly similar to other droughts. So we asked them to describe what they thought was similar or different, and here are a few examples of how respondents see flash drought events as being different from other droughts. Many of the comments align with the same themes described earlier. So an example of a difference in drivers is captured in this quote. The early onset of hot temperatures combined with extremely low growing season rainfall was unique to me. An example of different speed of onset. The drought event completely reversed previously wet conditions in an unusually short amount of time, so fast that it became difficult to accept that wet conditions were completely erased and not persisting. Different impacts are described as rivers, lakes, and streams were not affected, water supply and industry were spared. Some mentioned perceiving the drought, the duration of the drought as being shorter than other droughts in their region. And some pointed to the intensity of the drought they experienced, saying it was more acute than others. And some respondents used those same themes to describe how the flash droughts that they experienced were similar to other droughts. For example, one person said that climatologically, the progression was similar, even though it was more rapid. And one said that they saw that the impacts eventually seemed to converge with other slower developing droughts. And one commented on the perceived speed of onset, saying, "It seems that most all drought events come upon us faster than we expect." These comments illustrate how flash drought might not be seen as something essentially different from other droughts, leading to confusion over the term. So with these results, perceptions of flash drought can be examined to some degree by the end user's region, sector, types of impacts that they experience, the drivers of the events, and the seasons of the drought emergence that they experience. And I hope you'll spend some time with the full survey report to do that. And then as you reflect on their answers, we are interested in, does it seem to you that tailored definitions of flash droughts might be needed for different seasons, regions, sectors, drivers, and/or impacts? So in the survey, we asked for your opinions on this. And in the graph on this slide, you can see what we found. You can think of the orange and blue as the percentage of those who have strong opinions for and against, while those in gray are neutral. So almost 80% of flash drought researchers said that flash droughts might require tailored definitions to address the types of impacts that they produce, for example, agricultural versus hydrologic impacts. And almost 70% said that flash drought definitions should be tailored by driver, distinguishing between those caused by heat waves versus precipitation deficits or lack of snow. But almost 30% said that drought drivers do not require tailored definitions. So approximately 60% said that tailored definitions might be needed for various sectors or geographic regions of the country. And then just under 50% of you thought that flash drought definitions might need to be tailored depending on the season in which it develops, but over 30% of you said that they do not. So, to wrap up, we find some difference of opinion in the usefulness of the distinction of flash drought and some confusion over the concept for end users. While the speed of onset seems to be the most common trait setting flash droughts apart from others for most respondents, other characteristics of the drought event may also be considered by some, and they may not align with the intentions of flash drought researchers. In addition, some end users may not be perceiving major differences between what we call flash drought events and other droughts that they experience, particularly in certain regions of the US. And finally, among flash drought researchers, there seems to be some discussion still needed over whether tailored definitions of flash drought might be useful for effective monitoring and communication. So in the time that we have now for discussion, and throughout the workshop really, we'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear if you're surprised by any of the findings. Do you see serious gaps in understanding between researchers and end users? And if so, what needs to be done to close the gaps? Thanks again for your participation in the survey and for your time today. Please feel free to contact me if you'd like to discuss the methods or the results further. My contact information and that of the NDMC is listed here. And with that, I will wrap up and turn the discussion over to Marina. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Tanya. And actually, I'm going to ask you if you could to go ahead and turn your camera on, because we've got about 10 minutes now for discussion, both on the results of your survey, hi, Tanya, as well as on any other questions that have come up from the morning. And as part of this process for all of you, just want to mention we're going to do a little screen sharing with notes, so that Molly's standing on hand to take notes as we have this conversation, thinking about some of the questions Tanya posed, and we've got a couple ourselves, just so we can document and keep track of all of our thoughts on this matter. Again, in addition to what's being shared in the chat box. Okay, just want to start out and see already we've got a question from Musavel. Go ahead.
Okay, let me unmute myself, and thank you, Tanya, for that survey. It is very refreshing to see what people say about the flash drought, and even among researchers, that's a very confusing terminology. The following are just my few observations regarding flash drought, having been working from CPC on this thing. So what I want to say is that the word it's all about the coining of the word. The drought word has been around forever, and people know that. Now we are trying to introduce a flash drought. So I think any definition that we come up with, and this is only my suggestion, is that the word flash. We take the word flash drought from flash floods. So by the very definition, what we should stick to and come up with is from the rate of onset of the drought, because that's what the word flash means. And by anything flash, it doesn't last forever compared to regular other non-flash. So not only should we define by as compared to regular drought, which sometimes like California droughts last for years and 5-6 years and so on, but we don't, no matter which way it's set up, we don't call that. So we should define it by the rate of onset and for how short of a period it lasts. So something which appears in a flash and goes away in a flash. So we have to correspondingly apply that to drought. And then rate of onset, very fast rate of onset, and which lasts for a very short period of time. This is the only way we can differentiate. Their causes could be all different. It could be due to lack of precip, it could be due to high temperatures, it could be due to high evaporation and so on. So I think if you want to adhere to the terminology flash and add it to the drought, we should, so that it will be less confusing. So that's where people come in. People think of a flash, they think of something which came in so fast and went away so fast. So that should be what I think we should plan to define if you have to come up with a new definition. So with that, I will stop and thank you.
Great, thanks very much for that comment. Anyone else with questions for Tanya? Or reflections on what you've just heard and how it might fold into our approach to, again, putting some guardrails on the definition of flash drought, how we use it, and how it's useful for others. Okay, Vicki, go ahead. Unmute
Hi.
yourself.
Hi, this is Vicky Zolte from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We've been dealing more recently with these what has been called flash drought, and I agree with the previous commenter that the onset, a rapid onset, of course, but then the unfortunate thing is that with the flash floods, they also, floods don't really last that long, whereas droughts do, and so I would agree that keeping flash for when you have short duration, but you don't know that ahead of time. So that makes it difficult to use that term. And maybe with what we're talking about, rapid onset or rapid intensification, because that's what we've seen, we might have a regular slow moving drought, but then, you jump 2 categories in a couple of weeks. And I've been thinking about it, but I'm not sure I have a good solution, because any word rapid makes you think it's also short. So then we have rapid onset drought, a rapid intensification drought, and it's less catchy for the audience's larger users or larger public.
Yeah, definitely. There were plenty of comments when we asked people to define what they thought flash drought meant. Plenty of people referred back to the concept of flash floods. So I think especially for those who are less familiar with the science, they're trying to see drought in that same way that they would think of a flash flood.
Tanya, I wanted to ask you, I know you touched on this a little bit, but I think it'd be nice to hear again, or maybe a little more in depth, what surprised you from the results, having done this deep analysis of the survey?
Actually not going in with any preconceived notions of flash drought. I'm more interested in what maybe surprises those who are working in flash drought. Some of the main things we found was clearly there's some uncertainty about what the definition is. I had a conversation with Brian Fuchs before when we were just putting together the survey results, and there's also plenty of confusion over what drought is. So, so the fact that there's a little confusion is probably not actually surprising. There were differences of opinion in how useful end users versus researchers thought that the concept was. That's probably not also surprising, but I think it's worth talking about. And then I think some of what is coming up in these questions and comments is, there are clearly a lot of different factors and differences of opinion in what they think of when they hear the term flash drought. So, so I think that probably, that helps to explain a lot of the, where there may be some confusion or how useful people think the term is. And as Amanda pointed out, the thinking about whether people see the droughts as more similar or more different, I think is probably something to really spend some time thinking about. Like if they don't really see them as that different, that maybe helps understand why they don't think of it as a useful concept, but then that all may be because there's still confusion over what they're thinking of when they think of flash droughts. So I think the responses themselves were very consistent. And, so I'm really kind of more interested in what as researchers, what you found surprising. If, do you feel like when you talk about flash drought, are people hearing it the way you intend it? Do flash drought researchers see flash droughts as more similar or more different than other droughts? We didn't ask that of the flash drought researchers, but essentially maybe they're not that different. Maybe it's a fine detail. That's kind of up to all of you.
Okay, and we'll be having some time in the breakouts and then beyond to have the researchers sort of explore this. Right now, from this vantage point, again, sort of keep putting ourselves in the mindset of the end users. I'm just going to read, if I can, Brian. Brian's got a question in the chat box, which is, who are we trying to cater to with the definition? Is it decision makers, the general public, or who? And Brian, I don't know if you want to add to that verbally, unmute yourself and add anything about that. Brian Hose.
And while he does, I will just say, I mean, this has come up here too. I mean, this is not a survey of the general population in any form. This is a survey of the NIDIS dues interest list. So these are folks who are involved in communicating about drought. I mean, our end users are communicating about drought. They're making decisions about drought. They're engaged in drought. So this represents a pretty specific part of the population.
Right, but I will point out, even within that population, perhaps not fully random, but on the other hand, these are our clients. You know, these are the people that we need to be providing information to make decisions. So we are going to particularly care about their level of confusion, et cetera. Okay,
absolutely.
Something he'd like to share. Go ahead, Jason.
Actually, this is Brian. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I guess as scientists, I think we get wrapped around the axle. You know, we've got 1,000 different watch warning advisories that all explain the hazard, which is wind. You know, so I feel like we get so caught up in defining everything and saying, well, this is a cyclone and this is a lake wind advisory and things like that, when what really matters is the hazard, right? It's the wind in this case. And so with drought, I understand wanting to differentiate. Yeah, it comes on quickly. And so, you know, we want to have data that helps us determine when this is happening. And maybe the important part is again, educating folks that, hey, this isn't a typical drought. And so maybe coming up with some terminology to explain, you know, that this isn't a typical drought. I understand that, but what would an end user understand more than saying, okay, well, this is what the scientific community decided, and that's what we're going with. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Tanya, do you want to go ahead, respond to that?
I think that's a really good point. I think, you know, from the end user's perspective, what do they need to know about the drought? You know, there's a reason that you refine definitions of other things. Is it because they need to act more quickly? Is it because the impacts are going to be worse than a different kind of wind, for using your example? So yeah, for what reason do your end users need to know that it's a flash drought is, I think, a really good question. And that's, yeah. So is it because they do need to take action more quickly? I think it was interesting that in the definitions, a number of people brought up the predictability of the event and feeling like it was something that kind of wasn't predicted ahead of time. It came on so quickly that maybe they felt like they were being more reactive than usual to that event. And so maybe, you know, in the communication, maybe it's like, yes, you haven't had a lot of time to prepare for this one. It's, you know, it's coming upon you a little bit more quickly. So I think that's a really important way to think about why you define it and how you use it in communication.
Right. Okay. I just want to do a time check. We are actually a little bit over into or again, quote, lunch break for those who are in that time zone. So please feel free, if you're ready for a break, to go off. But we do have at least 3 people who have raised their hands, and I'd like to at least give them a quick chance to ask their questions. Going back to Jason Otkin.
Hi. Yes. Been a very interesting conversation here. I just wanted to comment on a few things here. You know, one with the confusion on the flash part of the definition. Flash droughts should not be compared to flash floods, flash mobs, flash whatever. The flash part is actually with respect to conventional droughts. So It's faster than conventional droughts. That's where the flash component comes from. And if you think about it in terms of time scales, yes, a flash flood may come and go in a matter of hours, but that's with respect to a more traditional river flood, which may last a couple weeks. Conventional drought may last months or years. So the flash drought is in respect to that rapid intensification. That's where the flash part comes from. And going back to what Tanya was saying about predictability, I think that's really key here, because if you're a stakeholder and you're thinking about this in terms of, well, I usually have a few months to get prepared for drought, seasonal forecast may be okay. But if you have a flash drought that develops in the matter of a month or two, it just gives you less time to prepare. So predictability is really key here. And I kind of think of this in the same regard as like, for those who may be involved in the hurricane community, there's a lot of focus on rapid intensification of hurricanes. Where they have to be aware of the fact that they may go to bed on Sunday and it's a Category 1 hurricane. By the time they wake up the next morning, it's a Category 3 hurricane. So it's really important then to spend time trying to develop tools to better monitor that rapid intensification, and because that then points in the direction of being able to better predict them too.
Great, thanks, Jason. I'm just going to move on right now to Kyle Lessinger, just because, again, given time, I want to make sure people have a good break here. So, Kyle? We can't hear you if you're speaking. Kyle Lessinger? Last call for your question. Oh, good. Okay. Mel, if you want to go ahead and chat, it looks like it won't, your audio is not working. If you want to type it in the chat box. Again, we are into lunch. I know this is cutting this conversation a little short, but we will actually be continuing it through the rest of the afternoon and then beyond. So thank you everybody for participating so far this morning. And thank you, Tanya, for a really interesting presentation. Didn't mention, but we are recording, well, I think you heard, we are recording this presentation of the overall workshop. And of course, we've got all the individual presentations. So we'll make those resources available afterwards. But again, please everybody take a break now for lunch. You're welcome to stay connected to GoToMeeting. We're going to keep it open. But again, this is your 45 minutes or a little bit less at this point to take a break. And we'll come back and then again dive into the more focused conversation about characteristics of flash drought and how we want to put guardrails on the term. Okay, thanks very much, and we'll see you shortly.